Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here for our event this afternoon, Emancipation Day Matters. So this program really emerges out of a larger concern about discussions around Emancipation Day in Jamaica. And as a museum, we're in the way in which it's set up in the region, our focus is really on the business of remembering and memorializing, both in material form and increasingly the intangible. And this series is really thinking about what happens to something when it's removed from public consciousness and its implications for museum practice. But before we go into the museum's theory, one of the first things we need to do is remove the discussion from the silo of Jamaica to a larger regional discussions on Emancipation Day. So today we're going to be looking at Emancipation Day celebrations in the English-speaking Caribbean. And our partner for the program is the Department of History and Philosophy at the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies. So I'll begin by introducing our moderator. Well, first, I am the curator of the University of the West Indies Museum. My name is Dr. Shani Ropo. Our moderator for the program today is Dr. Rodney Worrell, who is a lecturer in the Department of History at Cave Hill. Our first speaker is Dr. Candia Mitchell-Hall, who is a lecturer in the Institute of Caribbean Studies and coordinator of the foundation course Caribbean Civilization at UWI-Mona. Her research interests and publications really focus on heritage and memory of the African diasporic peoples. She has written several papers and presented at conferences at home and abroad, and she's the author of Memory, Memorializing, and Martyrdom in Post-Revolutionary Grenada. Our second speaker will be Dr. Winston Fulgence, who's a historical anthropologist and Dean of Academic Programs at the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College in St. Lucia. He's also the president of the St. Lucia Archaeological and Historical Society. His work is a comparative study of monuments to commemorate slavery in the regions involved in transatlantic slave trade. His research interest includes commemoration of slavery and its legacies, the development of plantation heritage across the contemporary Caribbean, and he has published several papers and book chapters. Our third speaker will be Dr. Marcia Burrows, who is a lecturer, actress, director, and producer. Presently, she serves as a lecturer in cultural studies at University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, where she conceptualized and crafted the cultural studies program. Her research interests include cultural practices and forms in the Caribbean and the process of identity formation. In 2013, she was awarded the Barbados Service Star by the government of Barbados for her work in cultural development. Our last speaker is Dr. Rita Pemberton, who is chairman of the board of trustees at the College of Science, Technology, and Applied Arts of Trinidad and Tobago, and former senior lecturer in history at University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. She's the former head of the history department, deputy dean with student affairs in the Faculty of Humanities, and past president of the Association of Caribbean Historians. Dr. Pemberton researches and publishes on health and environment in Caribbean history and the history of Trinidad and Tobago. Some of her most recent publications include Cuba and the Anglophone Caribbean, Perspectives from Trinidad and Tobago, and War, Food and Security, Feeding Trinidad and Tobago in Wartime 1939 to 1945. Well, I'm really excited for this discussion, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Worrell. Dr. Worrell, thank you.
Greetings. Thank you very much, Dr. Roper. I wish to thank the organizers and the high-powered panelists for this very timely discussion. Just last week in our Caribbean Civilization course, we were discussing this question about Emancipation Day, where the students celebrate Emancipation Day. This question, however, is something that is always being debated. Every year in Barbados, you get the purists or the ideologues or the activists from the Pan-African circles, like myself, for the non that there's always this contention. And every 7 years, right, Emancipation Day would fall on the same day as Kadooment Day. So this would always serve to create some degree of tension. So I'm glad that this panel is going to look at Emancipation Day from many different spaces, because inside the Carib Civ classes, right, we were getting different perspectives from the students. The Trinidadian students were very enthusiastic, it seemed, about Emancipation Day. I had a few Guyanese students who were very big on Emancipation Day. But then other students, you know, Emancipation Day did not mean a great deal to them. Mm-hmm. So I was having a conversation with Dr. Carter, and he was telling me about part of the Today in Beijing history program, that they had looked at what happened on the 1st of August, 1838. So on the 1st of August, 1838, the former enslaved in Barbados, they went to church, and you had the church bells ringing and people giving thanks for living to see the day. However, the next day, 5,000 laborers went on strike. So the struggle continued on the plantations. So I know, and I hope that you would answer some of these questions, but I tossed them out nevertheless, about whether emancipation was just an event or emancipation was a process. And we know, for example, that the 1st of August was a big day for the Garveyites. All of Garvey's big conferences would take place, start on Emancipation Day, and it was a big day for the Garveyites in Barbados. And during the height of Black Power, for example, the Black Knight people, in 1970, they called for Emancipation Day to be celebrated as a public holiday in Barbados. And Jamaica and Trinidad were in the vanguard of this emancipation as a public holiday. And Barbados got on board in 1998. So without detaining you further, I would like my colleague, Dr. Candia Mitchell-Hall, to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction, Shani, and thank you, Rodney. Greetings to the audience. I am delighted to present my thoughts on the practices and issues around Emancipation Day celebrations in the English-speaking Caribbean by drawing on the experiences of Grenada. It is really quite an apt moment to have this conversation, especially within the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and reparatory justice. And I really just want to recognize all those who have enriched the historiography in this vast area of study. I wish to also recognize John Angus Martin, a heritage expert and past curator of the Grenada National Museum, for sending me important prime resources on the issue, and also to the students of Caribbean civilization for wrestling with the meaning of emancipation and Emancipation Day within its complex and nuanced history. Actually, the title of my talk, Bold Face, Symbolic Commemorations of Emancipation Day in Grenada, was partly inspired by those conversations with my students. Now, the notion of emancipation and therefore an Emancipation Day was born in contestation, ambivalence, and apathy in Grenada. I argue that Emancipation Day commemorations operate within a complex network of colonial and post-independence experiences, which privileges a triumphalist narrative of freedom, whereby the British state is presented as benevolent, while the role of the enslaved peoples in ending slavery and ushering in emancipation is trivialized. This presentation will underscore how the cultural elites framed William Wilberforce as the savior of emancipation and embodiment of British humanitarianism, while silencing and demonizing the commemorations of the descendant community in Grenada. It is quite clear that the cultural elites targeted Afro-Grenadian commemorations of emancipation by minimizing and backgrounding their experiences. So by way of context, I return to the moment at the end of slavery to assess the notion of emancipation within its incubatory period. From its early beginnings, emancipation was contested in Grenada. It was packaged by the British Parliament as an ideal that could only be assuaged by a period of apprenticeship, which was implemented on 1st August 1834, 1 year after the Emancipation Bill was passed. Now, apprenticeship retained the dehumanizing psyche of chattelizing Black bodies, as it was really a period of compensation to the planters by the laborers, by the labors of the enslaved peoples, whose status would only go through a linguistic proposal of apprentice. So essentially, the apprentices paid for the freedoms, which therefore made apprenticeship an extortionary mechanism. Now, to properly understand this conflict, one must ask the question, how did the apprentices respond to this term of apprenticeship, or what was called the first flush of emancipation? My starting point is through a newspaper article from the Grenada Free Press, which reported aspects of the apprentices' responses to the apprenticeship period. According to the Free Press, they angrily contested apprenticeship in a most spectacular manner. On the morning of 1st August 1834, we are told that the apprentices made a lot of noise and quarreled that apprenticeship, or what they called half-free, was the mockery of full freedom. Said the editor, they were vociferous in their discontent. So they made threats and they fought broke out between the apprentices and sugar management. They stoned the plantocracy even, and many were charged, arrested, beaten, and punished on the treadmill. Nonetheless, thousands of Black Grenadians turned out at the market square to hear the declaration read and to celebrate the occasion wildly in the streets by jumping, dancing, and beating the drums. So in a sense, the tone for full emancipation was sealed in those formative years. So when it came on 1st August 1834, the freed peoples celebrated the long-awaited day in thanksgiving at church, at gatherings at the market square, and processions in the towns. According to oral tradition, the first Emancipation Day conveyed a carnivalesque atmosphere as the newly freed peoples reveled in the possibility of what freedom would and could mean. Nonetheless, the Free Press is quite silent on the commemorations and notes that the day was quiet, that there were no major celebration, and in a pejorative rhetoric, that there was a lot of noise. Of course, 1st August 1834 would set in motion the beginning of a tradition of the official disregarding of emancipation for the next 50 years, and the demonizing of Afro-Creole commemorations of Emancipation Day. For one, the planters, who were quite vexed over the loss of their property, completely ignored the day and referred to the celebrations in pejorative terms, such as slave emancipation, Negro holiday, and Negro emancipation. We can gauge from these pejorative constructs how emancipation was narrowly perceived by the cultural elites and the implications for its transmission in time and space. Now, fast forward 50 years later, at the Jubilee of Emancipation in 1888, the question of true emancipation would circle several times, first in the legislature, and then in the activism of political actors in their newspapers. They clamored for representation in the colonial legislature. Hence, the cultural elites really just utilized the Jubilee anniversary of emancipation to clamor for their own political representation. And here we see the politics of emancipation at work. But the war for political representation didn't end there. The cultural elites argued that emancipation had not translated into economic gains nor political freedoms for the large descendant community who remained powerless and voiceless. They noted that the freed peoples had never been compensated at the end of slavery, and that those who had benefited from compensation exercised hegemonic control over the masses. And here we see that Afro-Grenadians had been having conversations about redeeming and repairing the injustices of the past from as early as this period. Now, having settled these broad questions, Afro-Grenadians participated in celebrations commemorated officially for the first time on 1st August and 2nd August 1888. The colonial state therefore wanted to make a big statement to signify the progress of the colony, and as such, the commemorations were heavily aestheticized. For instance, St. George's, the capital city, was illuminated and decorated with buntings and banners, flags, churches rang their bells, Thanksgiving services were held, there were athletic sporting events, the police band played musical renditions and so on. In terms of material commemorations, the political activists who were undeniably double conscious recommended the erection of a good girls' school to be named the William Wilberforce Memorial Girls' School. It was argued that such a secondary school could fill the void and mark the progress of the colony. Of course, the horrors of slavery and resistance of the enslaved peoples were completely ignored and sidelined. The celebrations were also imbued with racial overtones and hierarchical structures of the plantation. For one, the announcement of emancipation celebrations was made in the public newspapers and limited the transmissibility to the freed peoples. Then 2 separate dinners were planned. One for the poor, called a public dinner, and then one called a magnificent banquet was reserved for the wealthy. I know that the aforementioned has resonance for Caribbean civilization students who are quite intrigued by these kinds of power dynamics. Of course, another major moment in the emancipation history of Grenada was the celebration of the tricentenary of Wilberforce's death. This commemoration served to buttress the master narrative of British benevolence, which was materialized in discourses over the role of Wilberforce in the coming of emancipation. For sure, the cultural elites did not want to be left out of the global centenary celebrations of Wilberforce's death, so they established a central committee to spearhead the commemoration in Grenada and launch a public education campaign to restore pride in Wilberforce. To the cultural elites, failure to honor Wilberforce's memory was tantamount to incivility. This central committee set about framing the entire context for emancipation through the dominant narrative that Wilberforce's humanitarianism had ended slavery, and he was presented as their best friend for life, who should be heroized through celebrations and material constructs. The committee would employ several rhetorical strategies, including deflection and trivializing the enslaved people's emancipatory praxis by enshrining Wilberforce as savior of emancipation. So in a sense, the masses bought into the single narrative of emancipation and they celebrated Wilberforce's death. But for their part, they had been schooled to view Wilberforce, not themselves, as the architect of their own freedom. And although they did not readily know how to situate themselves within their own emancipatory praxis, they knew that they had to denounce the poor socio-economic conditions they had endured almost 100 years after emancipation. So in 1931, over 10,000 Grenadians marched in protest in St. George's with the renowned Afro-descendant, astute politician, and West Indian statesman, T.A. Marisho, to clamor for improvements to their socio-economic lives. But how did the descendant community view the official celebrations of William Wilberforce? The descendant community expressed varied responses to the commemoration. it would be difficult to distinguish between those who completely resisted the commemoration and those who opposed. But what is imperative to note is that the political activists strongly supported it, and they went to great lengths to convince the skeptics to show gratitude to the memory of what they called God's gift of Wilberforce to the world for our salvation. On the other hand, resistance and opposition was quite widespread amongst the masses. Attendance was low as Afro-Grenadians attempted to distance themselves from a hegemonic inflection of emancipation. And of course, the chronic economic struggles they faced kept them grounded to their own spaces. Therefore, many strategies had to be deployed by the state to encourage the masses to commemorate Wilberforce. For instance, the administrator granted pardons to prisoners. Thanksgiving Day services were held. Large processions were led by primary school students who sang the song Liberator, and the poor were fed in Wilberforce's honor. Schools throughout the colony served treats to their students to toast Wilberforce, and poor houses were erected. Finally, a section in St. George's Cemetery was renamed Wilberforce Cemetery, which was a cemetery that was once called Popper's Cemetery, and a gate was commissioned in his honor. This section of the cemetery was the final burial ground of the poor, marginalized, and destitute in the society. So, of course, the decision to commemorate Wilberforce in this way was quite symbolic. It solidified in the minds of the people that Wilberforce was the friend of the enslaved Africans and their descendants in life and in death, and that he was indeed the liberator from the drudgeries of life, even unto death. Of course, 1 year later, at the centenary of apprenticeship in 1934, the Emancipation Committee conflated the centenary of Wilberforce's death with the celebration of emancipation, and a large commemoration ensued. They also opened up the Wilberforce Memorial Gate and used the occasion to shape the memory of Wilberforce in the minds of children, who were made to pause in reverence in front of the gate and sing the song, Wilberforce the Liberator. 4 years later, though, in 1938, at the centenary of emancipation, the Emancipation Day tenor had changed. The significance of the 1938 Emancipation Commemorations was the context of the 1930s. From 1934 to 1938, the descendant community had articulated their discomfort with the remnants of the plantation system and the so-called gains of emancipation by staging varying protests throughout the British colonies. They were unsettled by the lingering poor socio-economic conditions and felt trapped within the racial and color hierarchies of the Caribbean civilization. Therefore, as Afro-Grenadians internalized what emancipation really meant, they resisted the official state celebrations. A popular newspaper of the day, the West Indian, which was owned and edited by T.A. Marichaud, noted that the unfulfilled promises of emancipation was revealed in the economic conditions and profound dissatisfaction of the workers. Marichaud advanced the notion that emancipation commemorations should be used to redeem Afro-Grenadians from the yoke of slavery. And it was at this time that Afro-Grenadians began to view the Wilberforce celebrations of the past as secondary to the Emancipation Day celebrations going forward. But there still existed varying levels of ambivalence, as many viewed the latter as a window through which to gauge a centenary of struggles and to give thanks to God for raising up men like Wilberforce. Now, in the post-emancipation period, and I want to just talk very briefly about this, the celebrations were changed from 1st August to 1st Monday in August. And while other Caribbean experiences often typify the Grenadian experience, this modification also serves to signify ambivalence, as pointed out by our students. What is starkly distinct in the Grenadian experience of emancipation is the fact that the nation did not seize the occasion of independence to erect monuments to the enslaved people's memory as occurred elsewhere. In short, the new nation did not attempt to revise its colonial memory through monuments and memorials, nor did it revise the economic disparities between the wealthy and the poor in the society. Instead, these conflicts heightened during the independence years. But as independence and as the period of independence gave way to the Grenada Revolution, the negative stereotypes attached to Julian Fedon, a Black freedom fighter, was lifted, and Fedon was reimagined as a national hero. This was achieved during the annual Heroes Day celebration during the Grenada Revolution. For almost 200 years of British colonialism, Fedon and the 6,000 enslaved peoples who joined with him to resist British colonialism were demonized as bandits. And although no material constructs were erected to memorialize Fedon and the enslaved peoples, the annual commemorative ceremony did much to shift the negative public perception of the Fedon rebellion in the nation. And in the absence of material memory, the nation continued to celebrate Emancipation Day, sometimes with ambivalence, but they always commemorated the day through their cultural constructs. In 2017, the boundaries of emancipation shifted towards materializing Emancipation Day through a monument erected at Market Square in the memory of the enslaved peoples. And at last, 179 years after emancipation, the new nation had come to see that tangible material constructs are critical in commemorating memory. So in the final analysis, Emancipation Day has always mattered to the Black community. What has been contested is the failure of emancipation to translate into material and social advancement of the masses in Grenada and elsewhere in the Caribbean. By extension, this failure implicates Emancipation Day. Therefore, the Grenadian professor of literature, Merle Collins, was correct in her assertion that emancipation is an ongoing and revolving process of which we're still engaged. And perhaps in time, we would come full circle and recognize that for Emancipation Day to really matter, reparative justice must also matter to the descendant community.
Thank you, Dr. Candia Mitchell. Right, sorry. Right, thank you, Dr. Candia Mitchell Hall. We are now going to have Dr. Winston Fulgence, the floor is yours. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Warrell. If I could share my screen here. Okay, I'm going to try to look at this from a different perspective, coming from the post-emancipation, not emancipation, but the post-independence period, and see how Emancipation Day matters and how Emancipation Day has been used for different purposes within the confines of the St. Lucian situation. So my presentation is titled Memory and Commemoration in St. Lucia. Okay, with the wider context of the Caribbean, we look at the work of Hickman, two pieces by Hickman, where he actually interrogated this decision by the Jamaican independence movement and how close they would put independence to emancipation, contending that there was a deliberate attempt to try to erase the significance of emancipation as a big day in the national calendar. Watson in 2009, in a very broad stroke looking at abolition commemoration throughout the English-speaking Caribbean. He looked at St. Lucia, Barbados, but also looked at a few of the other islands, Dominica, St. Lucia, I think. And he also spoke about the fact that there was a certain amount of ambivalence towards the celebrations. Annie Paul looked at the use of emancipation and how it is used by the nation state to justify to legitimize itself. Within the context, I'd like to look at commemoration in St. Lucia and how emancipation has been deployed within the wider society. In my research, I was surprised to find that emancipation had not been something that had been sanctioned by the state in the manner in which it had been happening in the other Caribbean islands. In St. Lucia, public commemoration of emancipation was being done by one small group, a group that had been ostracized for a very long time. The Rastafarian community were the only ones publicly having ceremonies commemorating emancipation. In fact, in St. Lucia, the first state-sanctioned public commemoration of emancipation took place in 1996, when a quasi-state institution, National Trust, had set up a public ceremony in which the Rastafarians, who had been doing it on their own, were brought in and set up a very interesting commemoration ceremony at a site called As La Liberté, basically the Bay of Freedom when translated from the French. Of course, as fate would have it, that there was a massive rainstorm on that day that was washed away, but it was the first attempt by a state-sanctioned institution to actually commemorate emancipation. The following year, 1997, something different began to happen. A new political party had come into power, and there was an emancipation address every single Emancipation Day up until 1996, 2006, sorry. The first one was done by the Prime Minister. Then it was done by a minister responsible for culture. And this was the main attempt at commemorating emancipation. Small subventions have been given to a small cultural entity, which eventually grew into what we call now the Cultural Development Foundation, and they would want to spearhead celebrations of emancipation on Emancipation Day. In 2007, the bicentenary was celebrated, but interestingly, that celebration took place under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was a very strange commemoration because of the ministry that was actually running it, but that's what actually happened. So there had been a type of ambivalence, not just by the society, but by the state in the commemoration of emancipation. A lot of these commemorations took place with televised lectures, panel discussions, but no massive public ceremonies. But as this ambivalence continued, something began to happen. Small villages began to have their own commemorations, and the one I have here is a village of Labra in the south of the island, and they chose Emancipation Day to have the carnival. Another small village on the east coast actually did something similar, village called a village of Miku. So they began to do these emancipation carnivals, which was a little strange because Carnival in St. Lucia is celebrated in July, but these villages actually began to do it on their own. So a kind of organic commemoration of emancipation, apart from the state-sanctioned stuff that had been more intellectual, more centered in the city of Castries. Why is this the situation? I'd like to deploy Michel Rolfe-Trujillo here when he spoke about the silencing of the past. The difficulty with celebrating emancipation is that you also have to speak about slavery. And slavery, as we know, is not something that's widely spoken of in the Caribbean, even if it is officially, at least, even if it's deployed when necessary. The first difficulty we have is that the archive for this period is actually not available to us, even now with the movement with the UCL project and so on, Legacies project, where now we can actually go and look at the archive for slavery and transatlantic slave trade online. But archive for slavery does not exist in the island. The island also has what I call a meta-historical narrative, and that meta-historical narrative excludes most of the population. The historical narrative is one that speaks of the island exchanging hands seven times British, 7 times French. It is what most children in school would come out of school learning about, the fact that we were 7 times British and 7 times French. There's the other thing. Plantations, which are synonymous with slavery, today have very little connection with slavery. Most plantations have been sanitized, and there's a trend now where plantations are no longer called plantations, because they're very often becoming boutique hotels and sites of leisure, something I will explore a little later on. Memorializations, that's how memorials and monuments are deployed. Most of our early monuments or mnemonic devices which commemorated the colonial past. They were installed into the landscape. And of course, we know this mnemonic device help us remember specific things. And of course, it was the glory of the colonial power. And the other thing, one which pains me a great deal, is the fact that history is not taught in primary schools. And of course, if we understand the importance of history and the fact that it's not taught in the primary schools, then there's a lot of forgetting going on, what I call willful forgetting, because you have not taught the people the history, but you expect them to engage in that history and behave in a specific way. I will look at two of these mnemonic devices I'm speaking about here, because I need to speak about the fact of how these things are being deployed, monuments are being deployed, sorry. The meta-historical narrative. I have two monuments here. One is Fort Rodney, and the other is Enniskillen Monument. Fort Rodney epitomizes the meta-historical narrative, because from Fort Rodney, you could look north from the island, you actually see the island of Martinique. And here we talk about Fort Rodney actually sailing from this bay called Rodney Bay. And he was able to sail north, and the Battle of the Saints saved Jamaica. You see, the history is always connected. That fort is now called Fort Rodney after Admiral Rodney. And the bay, which interestingly, I did some research recently, the bay was not called Rodney Bay, but today it is called Rodney Bay because of a rebranding which was necessary, because there was a need to improve the property value of around a swamp, which had been drained to create a marina. So here we have the activities actually reinforcing that meta-historical narrative. And Fort Rodney is a heavy fort which sits on the memory of slavery. What's interesting is the fort was built with slave labor, because the historical documents tells us that every planter was supposed to provide one slave to provide labor to actually build the fort. But that is never part of the historical narrative around Fort Rodney. What's important at Fort Rodney is that is where Rodney saw the French fleet leave Martinique, and he gave chase from Rodney Bay, which at the time was called Groseley Bay, Big Island Bay, because Fort Rodney is on Pigeon Island, which has now been connected to the mainland with a causeway. The next monument I would look at as another mnemonic device is the Enniskillen Monument. This monument was installed in 1935. And the ironic thing is, it is memorializing the victory of the Enniskillen Regiment, an Irish regiment which had been part of a massive British invasion in 1796. This Enniskillen regiment actually won what we call the Brigand Wars, where the enslaved Africans had taken over the island with French help, of course, and had defended Fort Charlotte, what was now called Mont Fortune, for 6 months. 2,000 troops versus 12,000 British invaders, and they held off for 6 months. The last regiment to invade the fort was the Enniskillen Monument. What's interesting is the victory of the Enniskillen regiment actually led to a re-enslavement of people in St. Lucia. But if you go to the monument, you will hear about the glory of the Enniskillen Monument, and it's actually on the highest point on what is now Mont Fortune, which was called Fort Charlotte by the British. So here we have a meta-historical narrative continuing, even when the history is not one that is positive for the wider population, African descendant population. Plantations. I could have found lots of different pictures to depict a plantation, but I thought this ultra-modern edifice on a plantation would be a little more impactful. This plantation was actually the site of a major historic battle, which was part of what we call the Brigand Wars in 1796, the same British invasion, where the British were routed by the formerly enslaved Africans who had escaped from the plantations and had become an insurgent force in the country. They defeated the British. The British had to withdraw. This plantation is now a major, how do I put it, boutique hotel, quite an expensive one. And you can see the edifice speaks of the fact, what I call the sanitization of the plantation, and the fact that the memory of slavery has now been erased on that plantation. It is still a working plantation around the boutique hotel, but no, the word plantation is no longer used in the marketing of that site. in 1996, the process started to create what I call a post-independence monument. A monument called Freedom Monument was unveiled on Emancipation Day 2018. What's interesting is the process from conception to installation took 20 years. In fact, when I began to look for this monument, it was lost in storage, and no one could actually identify whether it had actually been built or not, but it had been constructed. The artist was frustrated. He couldn't put up his monument, but he had been commissioned 20 years before to put this monument up. It ended up being installed in a square. Now, if I may go back a little, the monument was actually supposed to be a counter monument to the Inniskilling monument, because it was supposed to be a monument to the formerly enslaved who had held the British for almost 6 months, which is a major feat, if you will. But that monument was never installed where it was supposed to have been installed as a counter monument. It was moved to the south of the island, or southwest of the island, and installed in a square. I will stick with monuments here because I want to juxtapose the two monuments and the two narratives where emancipation is juxtaposed against independence. This monument is a monument that, by any measure, when compared to the Freedom Monument, was built in a flash. This monument, if you look at it as a mnemonic device, what do we remember here? The monument is called All In, and it was unveiled for the 40th anniversary of independence. We have 4 figures rowing. What I found interesting is, for me, it was the creation, the perpetuation of this meta-narrative. But monuments, because what we're talking about here is everyone paddling together as one nation. I continue the meta-narrative. This picture was taken, and it was in the newspaper. And if you look at the phenotypes of the individuals involved, you could see the meta-narrative, the fact that we're talking about all in. 40 years later, everybody's working together. But what I've found, and I've been researching this monument, and I like to put it against the Freedom Monument, the type, the fact that we have a face, we have a phenotype, a warrior. Here, we have no faces. We just have people. And when this monument was unveiled, there was a negative reaction because it was actually not supposed to be a historic monument. But the fact that you're talking about a nation together, I think those who conceived the monument had underestimated the power of history. There's a lot of negative reaction. Initially, there was this, yes, we love it, we're all together, but there was eventually negative reaction. And I would use the word here, take the, people are talking, when I heard people referring to it, the niggers rowing in. But this is not what it was supposed to represent. It was supposed to represent everybody. So here we have emancipation clashing with independence. And I think it is the problem that most Caribbean nations have. But I thought these two artifacts, these two monuments juxtaposed would bring that clash to a head. Because the Freedom Monument is in the south of the island, not where it was supposed to have been unveiled. It was unveiled when, in the unveiling of the Freedom Monument, the emphasis was on the square in which it was unveiled in, and not the monument itself. However, this was supposed to be the national narrative around this monument. Here we have the Prime Minister, the artist, and a number of government dignitaries. You see a child dressed up as an Amerindian, because we don't have a native Amerindian population anymore. We have Indians, and we have people Caucasian descent and so on, representing the whole nation. And my argument here is that monuments are being deployed as moments. Emancipation is being deployed through these monuments as moments rather than a process. The political elite would prefer to use emancipation as a moment rather than have to deal with the fact that the process of emancipation is still ongoing. How do you justify your hold on power if you are unable to complete the emancipation process? And I look at this digress in 2004, in the public historical sphere, in the public historical sphere, visual arts and monuments are important to the evocation of denial of memory and the nexus of reclamation and invention of an invention significant to the making of history and identity. For me, these two monuments battling each other epitomizes this. One is supposed to help us to remember one thing, and the other, which was supposed to help us remember national historical narrative, is now clashing and making it difficult for that to happen. I will pause there because I know I've raised a number of issues, and I'm leaving an open question as to whether emancipation is actually a process or a moment for the wider Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Winston Fulgence. Now we have Dr. Marcia Burrows.
Thank you, colleagues. Massa Day done. Good afternoon. My focus is really looking at the usage of art, verse, poetry, folk songs, calypso, that generate various meanings of emancipation. Emancipation, as I think my colleagues before have stressed, we're looking at interpretation and the ideas of emancipation that are continuously contested and challenged. And I want to start with Camo Brathwaite. He has a poem called Milkweed, which is a mother poem. But I've chosen this particular verse because it helps, for me, it helps us to start to explore what are the meanings of slavery. Camo gives focus to an enslaved worker who was sitting in a windmill pushing the sugarcane through. A tedious, monotonous, every enslaved worker who was assigned to the windmill has to do it. It's an 18-hour job a day plus more in the height of the sugar industry and the time when you're crushing the cane. And Camo is really saying, look, he slept, he fell asleep, he lost concentration. And we know from historic evidence that there would be many enslaved persons who would have been walking around without fingers or half a finger gone. Or you read of horrific stories when someone is pulled in through the mill. I mean, the abolitionists used that when they were campaigning. So art here allows us to seek meanings of something it is difficult to imagine 200 years later. Look at his hands, cactus crackle, prick, worn smooth by the hoe. He has lost 3 fingers of his left hand, fallen asleep at the mill. The black crushing grin of the iron-toothed ratchets have eaten him lame, and no one is to blame. So when we're thinking of the Black experience as dictated by sugar, one of the tracks that I'm covering that my colleagues have earlier covered are the narratives. Who has the power from a Foucauldian point of view? Who has the power to develop the narrative? And what do they focus on? So if we're looking at the 300 plus years of slavery, really and truthfully, history doesn't talk about losing fingers. They would say that poem is really, no, throw it away, because it's not speaking to the brilliance of sugar. And we in Barbados, in the histories of Barbados, as told, have celebrated sugar, celebrated the success of sugar. So I quote Trollope, who was here in 1859, and he spoke with a white Barbadian planter, and he says, you know, we produce 100,000 tons of cane every year. You know, that's an awful lot of sugar. The we being a holistic we that really boils down possibly to the minor elite, very few, but it becomes the we because the island is known for its sugar, and the sugar industry is successful. By that we, you erase the thousands of we, such as that gentleman who fell asleep at the mill and no one is to blame. So in looking at the monuments and the works of art, and who has this story, who tells the story of sugar and slavery and emancipation, power dynamics are very important. I've just opposed 2 things. Massa Day Done is a calypso that Gabby sang in 1997 when finally there was a public commemoration of emancipation. But when we look at what's happened between 1838 and, for example, 1938, this is what we recognized. Yes, the populace definitely recognized emancipation. As Rodney said, our chair said in the beginning, church services were held, going out on bank holidays. But we also in Barbados have a little folk song that I sang growing up, but not realizing this verse. So it's lick and lock up, done with, hurrah for Gin Gin. And Gin Gin is supposed to be Queen Victoria. And we have several scholars who have looked at that. For example, that presentation on Grenada, the seeing of the god of England, the god of Wilberforce, the god of Queen Elizabeth, Victoria as the savior. And that tussle is throughout many histories within the Caribbean. But as a child growing up and hearing this song, recently I looked at the verse. The next verse says, they sell me mother for 6-bit piece. Hurrah for Gin Gin. So as a child and as a young adult in secondary school, I sang that without thinking of the meaning of what? And I sat here in my office a few years ago when it wasn't COVID and the place is quiet. And there was a Black History Month celebration and some primary school kids came up from St. Stephen's. And I heard this song coming through my door and I thought, wow, hurrah for Gin Gin. And then I literally looked it up in Barbados folk songs and saw that. I have asked a number of persons if they recognize that this was part of the verse. So far they haven't. Rodney, were you aware of that part of the verse? But you're the Pan-Africanist, so you'll say yes.
No, you have to ask Snaffy Marshall about that.
Yeah, we sing it. We don't have time to go through the whole verse, but the verse is really, hello, good, 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 hurrah for Gin Gin, etc. And now in recommemorating or reimagining emancipation, little kids sing that, and they sing that nicely. They sell me mother for 6-pence piece, hurrah for Gin Gin. Lick and lock up gun with. So you can erase meaning, create meaning, superimpose meanings, bring in the power dynamics. Popular culture serves up several meanings of emancipation. Quick shot, this is from the late 19th century. We do not know where yet. Thank you very much, Mr. Lennox Honeychurch, who found it in an album in Dominica labeled as Barbados. So when we think of what happens on Emancipation Day or bank holidays, yes, the tap band will play Moko Jambi, or as we said, stilt walkers, and they will be dancing. So we know that that was happening, that the populace recognized emancipation, had meanings of emancipation. Also, there's another shot, I believe, late 19th century, goat racing. So everyone is dressed up in their Sunday best. Something we don't see in Barbados anymore. Everyone is tied, their head is tied. And goat racing was a popular event. So events would be put on stage that either the populace have done, but notice I haven't said the state, I'm talking about the people. So when it comes to 1937, again, I've put Gabby's there, Massa Day done. Massa Day wasn't done, huh? Massa was very much in power in 1937. So 100 years after slavery, what we have, there's poverty, there's unemployment, wide unemployment. This is David Brown, the historian. Malnutrition and hunger. If you were to speak to them about the meaning of emancipation and their lived experience, this is what happened. So then you have the breakout of the riots. Brown rightfully says, let's say rebellion. And we have a number of movements that begin. So emancipation has been around in some form, in heads, actively looked at, but really and truthfully, the lived experience is saying, for example, in the, we do know that the wages for Barbados didn't go up in 100 years. So that what they were being paid in 1838 is what is highly possible what they were being paid in 1938. I hope you can see this thing. Historians recall that Emancipation Day was on the official calendar. This is something that I will look into, but it seemed to be removed in the 20th century after some powerful members of the plantocracy said they were uncomfortable with such a celebration. And that's a journalist who was preparing some of the write-ups for the celebration in 1997. So yes, again, what my colleagues before have said, the ambivalence, the struggle for power and meanings, and this older voice. I saw Candice here call them the cultural elites. It's a nice way of putting it. He who has the money, and mostly he who has the money, and the power and the might to overrule national governments and national concerns. So Glissant speaks about a belief in a single history, that history, as far as big H history, if they're historians here, they'll understand, big H history is the official discourse, that there's only one history and we tell it. And it is possible that the discourse of history for Barbados did not take on emancipation officially for 150 plus years and 60 plus years. For example, in 1888, when there was an outpouring of requests for a commemoration of the Jubilee of Emancipation, 1888, literally the plantocracy paper wrote, "We fail to see either rhyme or reason why we should have a celebration." And that was it. So Candia, all of your lovely things of bunting, zip, zilch, nothing. But we know that the populace went on bank holidays and they went on excursions up to Bathsheba, etc. So when it comes to this single history, the single history takes it off, puts it on the calendar, 150 years later, it's a major controversy in Barbados. It's now 1984, and Barbadian historians, activists like Rodney, Rastafari, they're pushing for an official public celebration, and it's voted out. As a matter of fact, the Black gendarmes, they said, no, you're making that up. So do we know the image of that Wilberforce created of the bodies laying in the bottom in the deck? They said that was made up. That when the images started to be shown on television, there was an outcry and forget it. So Barbados with Ilombe Motley, the NCF had intentions to have a 4-year celebration between 1984 and 1988. It was literally shrunk to 1 year. Slavery cannot be watered down is Trevor Marshall. 1984, 150 years, and we're still fighting the single history. Then Glissant speaks about the struggle against a single history is a cross-fertilization of histories, possessing a true sense of time and identity. As long as you continue to be engaged in and allow the domination or fight, that single history will continue to dictate your construct of identities and time and space. And really, is it important to have emancipation, or is it not important to have emancipation? Hilary Beckles is always reminding us that history, big H, as in the official single history, has viewed emancipation as not as a social revolution, but as an administrative problem. Tell me how we can solve the problem of Maria, as they say in but that is what has happened with us in Barbados, at least. And then in 1997, this happens. Now, to my colleagues here, I did do a dash into the library, and we don't have access to the Nation, but we've got access to the Advocate. So my pictures will be really literally out of the Advocate. In 1997, officially, the state, I wasn't aware St. Lucia did it in 1996. So Winston, what we were speaking about before, it's possible that they coordinated because Jamaica did as well, that there was this regional response to let us officially have emancipation. And that year, the Mighty Gabby sang a song. One of the verses is, "It is time to settle the score." Massa, they're done. And he won the crown. He won the crown. But this was not an easy rollover. To say we were going to do emancipation, you had voices of resistance yet again. Woodville Marshall, for example, is quoted in the newspaper about how, we tend to suffer from selective amnesia. We remember some things, we forget some things. But on the 1st of August, public holiday. But I want to draw your attention to this work of art. He was officially called the Emancipated Statue, the Emancipation Statue. He was not supposed to be a he or a she. I'm going to talk about that. And he was not supposed to have a name. He also wasn't supposed to have on pants. So the meanings of emancipation got fought over. Okay, yes, we'll have a statue. Karl Bruchhagen was flown to London to draw pants on the statue. Remember what you call them again? The colored elites, the colorful elites. This was a real outcry. How can we put a statue up sans clothes? He must have on pants. And so though the design went up and the bronze was made, we flew the artist up to draw shorts on bussa. So the meanings of emancipation came not showing manhood, not showing any kind of nakedness. Yes, his top can be naked, but he must have on shorts. And that was 1997. So in 1997, thousands of people showed up. I'm seeing 4,000, 4,005, you know, in the newspapers, you underestimate. So it's possibly over 5,000, 6,000. But Al Sharpton came in for the commencement and he made a number of speeches. He's quoted as saying, we've broken the physical bondages, but the psychological chains still remain. Also, that too many people of African descent are taking the emancipation of slavery for granted. The following year, we brought in Fidel Castro. Again, there are reports of smaller crowds and the meanings get contested again. Is it because an outward protest to Fidel Castro, head of a communist nation? So some persons might have chosen not to come out to commemorate, do the emancipation walk because it's Fidel. There are also arguments about crop over, that the night before there had been celebrations and perhaps persons were able to get up and come out and do the walk and celebrate emancipation. So meanings are instantly there again. The struggle of meanings comes again. We start to hear the business communities over the decades since 1997. I've put it in lovely English, the overabundance of holidays. What is you hear is too many holidays, they're always on leave, too many vacations. And actually, if I'm listening to the discourse in Barbados now, some of the working populace have started to agree. Gramsci is right, you go to this thing by consent. So what are the constructs of freedom here? What are the constructs of emancipation here? Recently, Kadooment Day, and Rodney made the point, Kadooment Day was initially installed. It's our big jump up day, masquerade day, as you have in Grenada, Candia, and you in St. Lucia. Elombe says that he deliberately moved Kadooment Day to the first Monday in August to celebrate emancipation. It wasn't declared as that, but the first Monday in August became noted on the calendar as the moment to have fun, do masquerade. After 1997, inevitably, the 1st of August would fall on the first Monday in the calendar. And we are struggling with it. There's a profound belief that Barbados is not Trinidad and therefore does not need more than one day for celebration. So what has been happening are the debates over what shall we do with the second day? And the second day is almost made to feel like a sixth finger. Like, you have this finger that is really not necessary. And essentially what happens is nothing. The celebration of Kadooment happens on the first day, the first holiday, and the second holiday, everyone stays home. So emancipation loses that sting. It is suddenly, oh my goodness, do we really need a public holiday? Or are we doing it when we do Kadooment? Can't we combine the two together? Massa Day, done? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burrows. And we now have Dr. Rita Pemberton. Floor is yours, ma'am.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this very interesting, informative discussion. Right. So what I've done is to take us to look at the situation in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, it's not one situation, it's two. And the trajectory is very different to what has been reported so far in the other territories. All right, so if we could go down the slides, please. All right. I want to say that we look at emancipation in Tobago in the context of a sugar industry that was dying, but was being held on what they thought was life-saving mechanisms. So when we see a small island with planters who are financially strapped, we know what we are getting to when we get into emancipation. But what is instructive is that before Emancipation Day, the lieutenant governor of the island made a formal declaration announcing this impending emancipation. And in it, he virtually told the people that there was going to be no emancipation. He said they had a responsibility. They must do their God-given thing and earn a living to support themselves. Mind you, the wages paid were like 8 cents a day. That was a high wage. So that they had a responsibility, and suggesting that their responsibility lied with working on the plantations. Now on the island, there really was nothing else to do. So the workers, now free men, didn't have a choice. When Emancipation Day came on the 1st of August in 1838, the formerly enslaved population in Tobago, like in the rest of the Caribbean, celebrated with church services. Now, what we are not told is that this was mandated by the imperial government, that church services be held to keep them together so that they knew what they were doing, to ensure that they didn't get into the anticipated, the expected retaliatory actions on that day. So right through the Caribbean, everybody was in church on the 1st of August. However, after the church service, people went in Tobago and had their own celebrations. And then they proceeded to go and spend the rest of the week on holiday. They weren't working. So it became an unofficial holiday. But what happened was Emancipation Day was celebrated in Tobago every year by the freed population right up until the 1930s. And here, I just need to point out one thing in case of Tobago, that it was a separate and distinct colony on its own until 1889. So when we come into the 20th century, it is Trinidad and Tobago we are dealing with, and the situation in the larger colony does impact on Tobago itself. In 1888, Emancipation Day was a public holiday in Tobago. And so across the emancipation period, the African people had an opportunity that did not really exist during slavery. They had an opportunity to give full expression to their traditions and the systems that, within them. This is us. So it was declared a national holiday by the government of Trinidad and Tobago in 1985. So between 1930 and 1985, the celebrations of Emancipation Day in Tobago took a different slant. It was much smaller. It was more contained within communities than it had been up to the 1930s. It was an island-wide celebration. Next slide, please. Right, Trinidad, similarly, 1838, they went to church, and there was an advocacy coming from the professionals in the late 19th century Trinidad for an emancipation holiday. But that was turned down by the ruling class because they said it was a bitter experience that they didn't want people to remember. And so that they put it down. They thought it might stir up racial hate in the country. And so we have in Trinidad no evidence of any long-standing organized celebration of Emancipation Day, but there were celebrations in communities. Then we have from 1970 on, the Black advocacy groups clamoring for Emancipation Day, which eventually was declared in 1985. All right, next slide. So now the celebrations, after the declaration was made, the celebrations were organized by NJAC, the National Joint Action Committee, and the new organization was called the Emancipation Support Committee. What they did, they organized public lectures, and they always brought in distinguished African professionals to give these lectures to groups across the country. Art and craft exhibitions, competition and school activities, various cultural events. The high point of Emancipation Day was one, a parade through the streets of Port of Spain up to the Queen's Park Savannah. You didn't have any opposition to that development, and afterwards I'll tell you why. So it was the opportunity. No, you've got ahead of me, Juan. Could you go back to the previous slide? Right. So in this procession, it was an opportunity to show your Africanness by your dress. So everybody who participated in that procession, and the procession was accompanied by music. So it was like a little jump up between downtown Port of Spain and the Queen's Park Savannah. But everybody ran out and bought fabric. And so the businesses in Port of Spain prepared themselves for the event and imported quantities of African print, fabric. And last year they complained, they grumbled a bit because there was no parade and the fabric was on their hands. So, but it became a big deal of business. And then Emancipation Village was established in the Savannah. So after you processed through the town and you had the talk from the political figures and so on, Emancipation Day messages came from different individuals, from the Prime Minister back. And then so you go down to the Queen's Park Savannah, and you have now the Emancipation Village, which was made up of a number of booths selling African food, and you have vendors coming from different parts of Africa selling stuff. Then you have other vendors, local craft people selling their wares at the Emancipation Village. So that has been a very big day on the calendar of Trinidad and Tobago since its establishment and its growth over a period of time. All right, next slide, please. So now there is an issue about celebrating emancipation. One of the problems we have is that the school population is not made aware of their history because it is not on the syllabus. And so a number of people do not understand the significance of emancipation. So we look at significance in terms of what it meant to the people who were liberated. They were allowed to engage in activities from which they were deprived during enslavement. So they have now greater access to their ancestral culture and traditions. And so this period of emancipation, which I see as a process, allowed the flowering of African Caribbean heritage, that you did not have the planters on your back restricting you. You didn't have the restrictions of the ruling class, but we will see another force emerging. So language, the people spoke in the way they wanted to. Their foodways went back to those of Africa. Dance, folk song, folklore. So what we have at emancipation and the years after emancipation was a cultural cauldron, and that all kinds of things were happening. The people became themselves. Next slide, please. Right. But it was more than a celebration for the freed population. It was an important time to link up with their ancestors on the ancestral land. Now, what we need to remember, one thing about the enslaved people is that desire to return to their homeland never died, even traveling across the Atlantic and coming into the Caribbean or the Americas. And so what they did was to try to create their homeland in the place where they were located. So you had a sort of cultural transfer. And if you look at the stories, the oral stories in the tradition of the African tradition, you have these ghost figures who could get back to Africa. Those ones who did not succeed in Tobago, it is Gangang Sarah. She was, the oral tradition says, she was sent to Tobago to take care of her people. And when she tried to fly back, she fell and she died. And the reason why she fell is because she had eaten salt. And, you know, the salt is symbolic here of one of the manacles that we have, what Derek Walcott would call the manacles that tied us down. So the emancipation period was a period of happiness. It was a chance to get free from the visible control of the plantation. I mean, control still was wielded by the poor working conditions and so on. So, but because you could now live on your own, you could live somewhere else, you had a chance to give expression to what you wanted, but you also still had that desire to get back to Africa. Okay, next one, please. So, what to the enslavers? What did emancipation mean? It means you had to get those people on the ground, continue to work for you at the conditions that you offered. Because Tobago, as the sugar industry was dying, it was not possible to get immigrants. They tried several. It failed, the authorities would not allow them. In Trinidad, they sought alternative labor. So now they had Indian immigration. Right. So now in Trinidad, you have this new group that's in there. Plantation owners really have contracts with workers so they could afford not to take on the demands of the African population for better working conditions and wages. But you have also in this period, the enhanced activity of the churches. So they serve as a force to deculturalize the African, because, you know, the Christian church frowned upon certain African practices. Oh, we've gone, could we go back? We've missed one. All right. So the churches were active in promoting African deculturalization. Next slide, please. Right. So what we have now, in Tobago, a decision was made to boost the island's culture and heritage by organizing what is called a Heritage Festival. It became very popular. It struck a note that resonated with the population because, you know, everybody had a feel. And in this Heritage Festival, the old-time wedding became very popular. It was organized much as an old-time wedding was done from the courtship codes and the families getting together and having the bongo night and all of that, and the ancestors speaking to say whether the match was a good one or not. And then the outfitting of the bride and the building of the house, you know, so it was a big thing. And it did attract a significant increase in the tourists present on the island. So the showcasing of the cultural heritage was used to boost tourism. And now this Heritage Festival was a 2-week, well, it is a 2-week operation beginning from the middle of July, and it ends on Emancipation Day. Now, when it ends on Emancipation Day, what happens on Emancipation Day? 2 things. One, we must note that the population that became engaged in these celebrations were younger and younger. And the evening of the nights of the Heritage Festival, you know, there were a lot of nocturnal activity and not alignment and so forth. But one night before emancipation, a group of revelers decided that the best thing would be to have an old mass. So on Emancipation Day, there was a Blue Devil old mass presentation. Well, some people, many people were livid because that was not Tobago's culture and that had no place on Emancipation Day. But what you did have as a result of the heritage activities late night and the other activities that were thrown into heritage, all sorts of things were thrown in. You now have people tired, and so Emancipation Day, they're resting, recovering. It became a distraction. So the very thing that was set up to help boost culture caused the Emancipation Day celebration to dwindle. What happened? Now you have a completely new generation. Nothing happens in Tobago on Emancipation Day. So what those who want a celebration go down to Trinidad and participate in that. Next one, please. So the Heritage Festival, 1987, it began. It runs for 2 weeks. It's stimulating tourism, and is that tourism is where we have the contradiction in this operation. If it's a tourism to bring nationals back, Tobagoans come home, that was the slogan one year, that is fine. But the other kind of tourism, next slide. So we have an ironical situation where the event that really nurtured heritage was the very event that led to its demise. It's like the cauldron of culture boiled over. Traditions were eroded. All kinds of things were presented, the sideline and forgotten. And Emancipation Day now continues to be celebrated continuously in Trinidad, while that tradition in Tobago has become somewhat eroded. Now, in the terms of visuals, Tobago does not possess any symbol, any tangible reminder of the presence of enslaved Africans on the island. In fact, there is one memorial that was established by the Colanders. And so our tour guides would take visitors to see this monument of the Colanders with their list of names. But somehow, the names of the 300 odd enslaved people whom they brought on the island were not recorded on that list. And we have not been able to stimulate the authorities to establish a monument on the island. Now, Tobago's enslaved experience began long before that of Trinidad. When there was a scramble for Tobago, at the same time, there was a scramble for St. Lucia, where there was a scramble for the colonies, territories of the West Indies. The people who came, the Dutch, the Colanders, the French, they brought enslaved people with them. But those persons have been blotted out of any record, any presence on the island. Next slide, please. So what we have now, a dilemma. We are looking for new sources of heritage, new unexploited, those that have lost. And we gone to the plantation relics, what I call the graveyards of our race. So to feed tourism, and as Winston said, you repurpose them, you give them a new image, and people forget what really happened in those spaces. So as we cause our tourism to thrive, our culture dies because we become more tourist oriented. So we have to present things that would attract them, things that they like, and we stifle what we consider the negatives that they would not like to see or hear. Now, the whole question of, next slide, please. the whole question of emancipation and its importance, to me, there's not even a question. Emancipation is a significant marker. It's an ongoing process. It facilitated the wide practice of African traditions. It demonstrated African resilience. For example, in Tobago, between 1838 and the end of the century, you had a population that was struggling against a well-entrenched planter class. And though that class was impoverished, politically and socially, it remained strong. And one of their missions was to keep the freed African population from being able to buy property. But there was a determination. So despite the low wages and despite the poor working conditions, freed Africans after 1838 were able to buy land. How? Tobago was used to cultivate sugar. The market was bad, but the cultivation of sugar continued until the final crash in the 1880s. Now, what they did was to use the matayage system, a sharecropping. So you gave your labor, and you used plantation property and buildings, and you shared the returns, profit or loss. For the most part, the sharing was highly unequal. So a plantation owner, okay, you have the molasses. No, they weren't sharing molasses and they weren't sharing rum. They were only sharing sugar, whatever sugar was produced or the returns from the sale of that sugar. The sugar was the lowest quality sugar that was produced in the region. So the returns would be lower. But the sharing, so if we have a cup, one for me, I'm the planter, one for you. Two for me, one for you. And so it went on, and it caused a lot of unhappiness. But then the planters had to deal with workers who worked their little plots of land, despite the intention not to make them have access to land. What was happening was that some planters were so desperate that they would rent land. And so people would rent land and they'd have their little gardens. And so they had time, they wanted time to attend to their own produce. And so it will compete with harvesting time. So what the workers did, they organized their own teams of labor. They employed themselves, so members of their group, and they paid more than the estates offered. And so they undermined the matayage system. And when they talk about matayage in Tobago, you'll hear the story of how it was the best example of how matayage worked. That's not true at all. So there was a lot of grumbling. And so you have your workers, you want them there, you can't get immigrants, so you're stuck with these people, and they have organized their teams and they take a contract from you, pay their workers more, and you want free labor. You want those people to work for you because you want to have control of them when you need, but they were telling you, no, we will come when we are able. So this African resilience in terms of the food, in terms of the ways food was prepared, and in terms of their culture and expression and their language, they held on to these. One of the important facets of the free Tobago society was the heavy concentration on what we call Lenhan. Lenhan was a system which provided for the community, which assisted people in the community. So example, when we are getting married, we say, okay, the family will live here, so we will help you clear the land. So all the men would go and they will clear, and the women will cook. So as the owner, you really don't have to put out. The community pays for that service, and the land is clear, and then you'll have another land hand operation where the skilled people come in and they will build a home, and you will probably buy the material, but the cost of the construction is borne again by the group, and they are fed for the day to get that building on. And the land hand went, you had a bunch of bananas you passed and you gave some to somebody who might be in need. And if you have somebody who was sick, you went in and helped. And if the parents of a child died or the child was orphaned, Tobago didn't have an orphanage, they found somebody took care of them. So the community took care of itself. The community amused itself. The community organized its sporting arrangement. And all that came to an end, one, by union with Trinidad, because it was a different kind of scenario in the two territories, and the opportunities for better wage earning were to be had in Trinidad, so you had migration. So what I'm saying is that an appreciation for the trajectory from empire, serving colonies to independent nations is important, but the role of Emancipation Day in that process is something that we should not lose sight of. And it remains important for us to do two things. One, to instill a knowledge of the true course of history of the region and of the territories in it, in our school population. And two, and secondly, that we have a comprehensive system of and support for reparatory justice in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had 4 excellent presentations. And I like the way that you ended, Rita, by saying a knowledge of history and repartite justice, because one of the things that I was going to say, and this was also in response to Fulgent's presentation as well. We have to continue to agitate for the teaching of history inside the schools. I think that we have done a lot of that in Barbados, and I think they are planning, and we know we don't, the promises we don't take to heart, but at least I was told that history was started in 6 schools. So it's part of a pilot project. So if this goes well, it might mean an extension of history. So all of these little tangential victories are really major victories in the struggle. So we have to continue to lobby for the teaching of history. And if we are serious about repartite justice as well, because how can we be talking about repartite justice? But this is a subject for another day. Before the questions come in, however, I have about 4 questions. So I ask all of you a question. So I'll start with you, Dr. Candia Mitchell. In the post-revolutionary period, was Fidan and the whole emancipation initiatives accepted by the populace? So I'll present the 4 questions one time and then you can respond after, yeah? To Winston, I'm very surprised that in an island that has been placing so much emphasis on tourism, and I guess they continue to place this emphasis on tourism, that they're seeing, based on what you presented, that there's no emphasis at all on heritage tourism by utilizing the plantation. So you can further comment on that. Marcia, how do you explain the refusal of the government to name the Emancipation statue Bassa statue, even though it was recommended by the director of the National Cultural Foundation at the time, and even though the populace, right, referred to this statue as the Bassa statue? So how do you explain this? And Rita, what do you say? And this is a question that came up inside of the class, so I will ask you this question as well. Would you say that the large budget of the Emancipation Support Committee is responsible for why Trinidad and Tobago's Emancipation Day celebration is the gold standard inside of the Caribbean? So yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. To address your question on Emancipation Day celebrations in post-revolutionary Grenada, I want to just return to that very delicate period in the post-revolutionary period. And the nation was severely polarized on the question of the revolution. Of course, the prime minister had been assassinated. And so during that period, we're not seeing a state thrust, so to speak, to commemorate emancipation in a major way, because the nation is trying to reconstruct itself. And there are large questions that the nation has to ask itself. It has to internalize and ask itself, how will we move on from the psychological trauma of the murder of Maurice Bishop on 19th October 1983. Now, of course, the folk would always celebrate in their varying pockets by drumming and by singing. And there were, of course, church celebrations, religious celebrations. The church has always taken a role in commemorating emancipation and providing a space for emancipation to be commemorated within its walls. The church would have varying ceremonies on emancipation or on the first Monday in August, which is when it was celebrated. So no, not greatly in that post-revolutionary period did we see a great movement towards commemorating emancipation. So there was no continuity from what the revolutionary government started, whereby they started to commemorate figures from the slavery period, like Julian Fedon, a Black freedom fighter who had led over 6,000 enslaved peoples to rebel, and who had held down the country, as a matter of fact, for 16 months from 1795 to 1796, and who had actually murdered the British governor, who was Ninian Home, along with other 48 British hostages, including lawyers and so on. So to answer the question, no, we did not see that great movement towards celebrating emancipation in the post-revolutionary period, the immediate post-revolutionary period.
Thank you.
Okay, your question is a very relevant question. And if you think of tourism and the major tourist markets for the Caribbean, I think you understand why slavery has to be scrubbed from the heritage that's on different plantations. There is heritage tourism. In fact, heritage tourism is, as you would know, one of the fastest growing sectors of tourism. So we market heavily heritage tourism. There are working plantations. You could visit a plantation and look at things going on. However, slavery is not part of the conversation. When we refer to slaves, enslaved people, we speak about the workers. And it's not unique to St. Lucia. I participated in a research project with Dr. Michelle Best a couple of years ago. I think it was 2013. We compared Barbados and St. Lucia, and it was very, very similar. We wanted empirical evidence because its observation is one thing, but we began to use questionnaires and ask the tourists about the knowledge of slavery before they went in and came out, and most people they found nothing on slavery. You could take a plantation tour, it would most likely not be called a plantation. However, there's no slavery. Slavery is forgotten and it's been sanitized. It's Disneyfication, as they call it. The plantations have been Disneyfied. It's leisure and pleasure. The plantation is a place of romance.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I support that. Rodney, thank you for your question. I was told 15 minutes, so I squished, and you're right. I left out a very major thing, so let me get it in. I've asked that question several times, including of his son, Virgil Bruhagen, son of the sculptor. And it's the artist desired not to identify an individual. That argument has been said over and over again, and the son agrees with that, that in creating this monument, he wanted it to be embraced by all. Not clear he wanted it to be male, but obviously it became male. He definitely didn't want pants. He wanted freedom. He got, that was written out. However, interesting enough, Caribbean people don't think in abstracta. So once you see a male in a covered pants, chains, by that time, and this is what I omitted, so I'm going to thank you again, Rodney. Barbados had, through Hilary Beckles, through Elombe Motley, they had recovered the memory of a slave revolt. I do not think the government at the time realized that the imagination of the populace was alive. Bussa was uncovered. Bussa became a national hero. I forgot that's a work of art. There were several works of art, including the painting of Bussa. Bussa was in the popular understanding. Here comes the statue, popular understanding, therefore Bussa is the statue. And there was a lot of outcry. This is the year of what they call the Great Controversy. So the 1984 to 1988 period were supposed to be several events were to happen. Majority got scrapped. I mean, literally got scrapped. Elombe Motley, who was at the time leader of the NCF, was fired, if you remember, Rodney. And he was the one who had commissioned the statue. And he said to me, he watched it unveiled. He literally stood on a hill. He wasn't allowed to be in the group, stood on a hill and watched it unveiled. Why did they keep the statue though? That's the key thing. I think that's the power of popular culture, because they touched everything else, but they left the statue there. At one stage, the roundabout was actually named the Emancipated Statue Roundabout. I've heard Hillary say that it went to Parliament. I haven't done the research, but it was officially renamed. The populace pushed the naming. We have to give it to the populace, the power of the imagination. Yoruba as well. Yoruba had led the African space and the response for a decade at least. They also were sidelined, but the statue remained with pants.
You, Marcia, thank you.
Yes, Rodney. I would say that the very generous allocations to the Emancipation Support Committee for the organization of emancipation has contributed to the extensive program that they could launch and the growing popularity of the event. But I don't know that is the gold standard in the Caribbean, but I do know that it does attract people from other territories who come to participate in the procession. The procession is something that is heavily covered in the international media with everybody dressed up in their fancy, and there's a little kind of competition among the revelers, to see who will come out with the most outstanding dress for the event. But yes, I think the financial allocations has helped. I don't know, well, we didn't have one last year, and we can't have one this year. We didn't have one last year, we didn't have one this year. I don't know what is going to happen next year. The likelihood is that the budget is going to be slashed considerably. So we will see how it works out.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, yours is the gold standard, because whenever we are having conversations about how we can make Emancipation Day more effective, even when we had a Commission for Pan-African Affairs, people will say, look at, and CAFR is a good friend of the people. So I'm speaking now wearing a different hat. So that is, yeah. So we are hoping to reach the standard of Trinidad. Now I'm seeing some comments here in the chat, so I will read them. And I think one is a question, one is a comment. This is coming from Jolly Wong. As a literature student, I am really enjoying these poetry references, which are typically the means through which I learn Caribbean history. And the question is for everyone on the panel, do you think the larger issue with Emancipation Day is our failure to engage the traumatic history, slavery? Also, does the focus on personalities such as Fedon and Busa pose an issue with conceptualizing emancipation as a process as opposed to a day? So, yeah, who will take the first bite?
Okay, definitely, it's really two great questions. Whether the issue that we have with Emancipation Day is because of our failure to engage the dramatic history of slavery. And I can tell you that when it comes to Grenada, for example, and elsewhere, of course, history is not taught in our secondary schools until, of course, students enter into the ages of and forms where they take CXC and so on. The other issue is that there is an institutionalized silencing of slavery discourse in Grenada. I'll give you an example. Tourist representations. So the literature that tourists engage as they come into the country notes, and this is from one of the popular ones, that we do not speak about slavery in this country because we do not want to evoke all of the trauma and the horrors of slavery. That is the specific language of this tourist representation. And it goes further to say, because we do not want to interfere, so to speak, with your holiday. Now, that is certainly deliberate because it comes from an agency of the government. Of course, other attempts at vocalizing and articulating a slavery memory is also silent. So, for example, years ago, a slavery enactment occurred on a plantation in Grenada. And while I know that there are several issues and controversies surrounding the reenactment, the attempt to place slavery on the altar, of course, was shut down. And when it comes to the Grenadian context, we do not only have to look at the fact that it's a reenactment and that nothing can reenact the pain of slavery, but that it could also have been used and be seen as an educational tool to educate children of the community. So there is a deliberate silencing because of our failure to engage this traumatic history of slavery, certainly throughout the Caribbean. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Winston. You're muted.
Sorry, definitely. The refusal to engage slavery as part of our history, not our history, but part of our history, has a part to play with it. But I also think there's something else going on here. If you look at the process, the chronology of moving from colonies to independence, we in the Caribbean have the unique situation where we didn't fight for independence in a manner that the South, other parts of the South had fought for independence. It was literally a war. We don't have these things. Personalities, yes, we have employed personalities to be our heroes, our fighters, our insurgent fighters. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think the difficulty is that we begin to lionize these people, men, if you will, these men, and we begin to do something that the Europeans have been doing for a very long time, which is to gender resistance, gender emancipation, which leads us to a situation where we're doing the same thing that we're supposed to be moving against in the Caribbean, which is that narrative. And the word comes up again, the meta-narrative, which I think Rita spoke about when she spoke about, Marcia spoke about when she used glissant in the discourse. So the other issue, I think, I'm rambling on here. I made some notes, let me focus on them. The other issue, I think, is that emancipation as an event allows for us to speak about slavery enough that it could be deployed as a political tool and not have the conversation. So emancipation remains an event rather than a part of a process, because as soon as you allow for conversation about the process, the political elite has questions to answer. How come things haven't changed for us in the past 200 years? Yeah. You have taken the reins of power. You are from us, quote unquote. How come you have? So it is very difficult for the political elite to marry these two things, or to deploy these two events, if you will, and allow for emancipation to be a process. Well, in a conversation, I think everyone is aware of it, but to have the conversation is going to be very, very difficult. So yeah, that's my rambling response to that question. Thanks. I'll stop here.
Okay. Like Winston, I jotted a couple of things. I speak to you from a space which has and celebrates having the 2 of the 3 oldest plantation houses in the Western Hemisphere. Oh, and we celebrate it through tourism. We celebrate it through histories, commemoration. I mean, Drax is being run down by Black Lives Matter in England. And we still have it. We're not sure what to do with it, and he is still thinking about it. So we have several battles. We have the physical, the tangible culture, the material culture that they say in heritage. We live around it, and perhaps we do what Stuart Hall says, seeing is cultured seeing, and we no longer see it. So at this moment, for example, St. Nicholas Abbey has now become a place of trains, and you go and have a nice little joyride, jug through the plantation. You don't say, oh, by the way, this is a sugar plantation, and people, no, you talk about the trains, and you outfit everyone in nice, cute little hats, etc. And you go, you repurpose the historical narrative. And that's one of the things that's happening. That meta narrative that Glissant speaks about, the speakers of the meta narrative find new ways to employ it. Put a train in the middle of a plantation, don't talk about what the plantation was about. There you go, tourism. And school children go and do the train rides, and we follow a new construct of identity. So history isn't dead. It's something that is continuously infused. And this is where I support all of my colleagues. We have to keep infusing it with narratives of what Glissant calls the little h history, the people's histories, the people's understanding. That's why I think they really call it Bassa, because breaking down that nice, large abstract that's Bassa. You have on pants. There was a time I saw them, they actually, for a celebration, strung Christmas lights through the chains, upset many of the artists, and then they lit the lights. So the poor gentleman became re-enslaved through lights around. To the point I want to say is, how else do we crunch this thing down? For the populace, we need to crunch down these meanings. Calypso is a way to crunch it down. Poetry is a way to crunch it down. Tap band is a way to crunch it down. Folk songs is a way to crunch it down, because we want the little h histories to start to deal with it. Emancipation lectures, I remember when they did have, that was the one thing that kept going, thanks to the history department of Cave Hill. The people would turn out in hundreds to hear an emancipation lecture and turn up every single night. So people are taking it in. I think we use all avenues, all the armies, bring everyone. It's a battle that we need to fight. As I think Derek Murray said to me, we have 400 years of fight because we've just had 400 years of narrative that we have to counteract. So it's not an overnight fight. It has to be a continuous fight. Rita?
What I would say about Emancipation Day as a one-day event minimizes the significance of emancipation. Emancipation did not happen in a day, and on the 1st of August, 1834 and 1838, no emancipation occurred. A law was changed, and that's that. People had to wring emancipation out of the opposing forces of the ruling class. Right. Now, the next thing about the presentation of the lack of sensitivity about the horrors of enslavement, it has to do with not being taught. If you are not exposed to it, so people keep asking, that really happened? Oh my God. I said, but I wouldn't say, oh my God. I mean, I read that in books so many times over what plantation owners did to enslave people, the whole process enslaved people went through to be brought here, you know, it's a horror story. I asked someone recently, I said, would you imagine what is it like for somebody to look at you, say, okay, you are my property, you now have my stamp, a hot iron is put on your neck or your back or your face, hot, straight from the fire. Can you imagine what that is like, would be like for somebody? But more than that, I gave a lecture to a church celebration about emancipation, and I was asked to talk about the role of the Anglican Church in slavery and emancipation. And I said to them, do you really want me to talk about the role of the Anglican Church during enslavement? I said, because there are two different discourses here. She said, yes, they wanted. So I took up the podium and I said, I want to start by letting you know that the Anglican Church was complicit in the whole process of slavery. I said, it was the Archbishop who produced the enslaved Bible. What? Bible? Enslaved? I said, yes, there's a slave Bible. And this was used to guide plantation owners and, to guide the churchmen working among the enslaved as to what they should say and what they should not say. And for those who ended up being able to read, that they would get no notions of liberation and equality, that those were not for enslaved people. So the church, nice little church ladies were very appalled. So I said, that's why I told you, I asked you if that's what you wanted to hear. But the truth is, the church was complicit. Think about Codrendon and all the properties and enslaved people. Yeah, when if you go through the islands, I mean, the church was really tied up in the estate business of plantations. So, you know, it is a horror story for those who just find out in the 21st century. But for those of us who have been digging down into the old books of the past, we know that, you know, that is what it was, and we could move forward from there. So what I want to say though, the persons who make decisions about tourism and the persons whose recommendations they accept are some of the persons we need to pay attention to, because some of them have no sense of history. And they are the people who move into plantations and you have a nice wedding venue in a plantation, people probably walking on some other people's graves. Yes. And, you know, I said, but if you use a plantation as a walk through the bush environmental experience is one thing, but if you use it as a place of leisure and pleasure, I don't think so. So we have to look at those people who are put as what they call them, CEOs of the tourist department, or the whatever they form, whatever formation is established in a particular country to drive the tourism business. And this person sees, well, we could get that market. What do we do to get that market? And we focus on supporting, supplying, and entertaining the market, which is not home people.
Rodney?
Go ahead.
I just want to quickly jump on that. Also, the individuals who now own plantations, who may not be descending from individuals who own plantations before. So quickly, I was invited to a wedding, and I go into a plantation and I pass the sign. The sign says 1703. I freaked out. You literally have a sign saying 1703. But the person with me didn't pick up the meaning of the sign. They were celebrating 1703. The wedding was held inside the windmill. The works had been taken out. So there was a shell, God help us, nice little frilly something or the other. And the table was put for the signing. And we sat and looked over a beautiful view of Barbados, a beautiful view. And I said to the person, but do you know if this was 200 years ago? It's a completely different space. There's blood, there's this smell of horror, there's where is the sugar house? And then the plantation is now owned by someone from Trinidad. And I said to them, well, can you show me where the factory is? He says, I don't know. I came and found it like, oh. So erasing, continual erasure, he's making his money. It's a very popular wedding venue. And no one had asked him the questions I was asking him. That's also what's happening as well with tourism, not just within the organized state tourism, but the individuals who own these lavish homes, and the upkeep must be mad, and make some money and have your wedding in the windmill. Don't talk about what happened in the windmill.
Okay, now I'm told that we are out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. When you are having these conversations, it felt like we only started about half an hour ago. So I wish to thank the presenters for the excellent presentations, and I'm saying very timely presentations as well. I'm glad that the recordings will be uploaded to the UWI Museum page, so that the students, and as I said before, the students of Caribbean civilization especially would be able to have access about emancipation across the region. And they will recognize the similarities and some of the differences, but they will also recognize the common threads here, that we have to continue to make this holiday relevant in places that it is not so relevant, and places that it is already very relevant. We have Rita to ensure that we get the funding and others and other support to make the holiday as relevant as it should be. And as I told the class, for me, Emancipation Day is one of the most sacred public holidays on the calendar. In fact, it might be as sacred as Christmas, or more sacred than Christmas, right? Because this is how I feel about emancipation. So I wish to thank you again, the panelists, for your engaging conversations, and hopefully this will not be the first and the last of these kinds of conversations, because we need to be speaking to one another inside of this Caribbean space. I wish to thank Dr. Roper and Samantha and Javier, and also Shelley for the hard work. And I recognize the hard work when I was seeing all of these emails coming at me. I thank you, and I wish you all of the best. And my colleagues and friends, please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.